question for Dr.
Okay, you have a question?
You've been traveling around Iowa. You've probably noticed some of the wind turbines out there.
Right.
And
Hello?
10%,
Yes.
well, nearly 10% of Iowa's energy, electricity, is generated on renewable resources. Do you support such a standard for the country?
Okay.
And if you do, what would be that number?
Okay, in general, I support the principle of renewable energy. I love it because it makes a lot of common sense. But I'm also a strong believer in the marketplace, and the market should determine which is the best one. Once government gets involved and either gives grants or subsidies, that distorts the market, but the market will sort it out which one is the most efficient.
Well, right now, coal is the most efficient. I mean, that's the cheapest kilowatt per hour. So if the market was turned loose, we'd see more coal plants. And I'm passionate about the environment. That's how I come to this,
Yeah.
is about the environment. And I'm concerned about the coal emissions. So that's why,
Okay.
renewable resources
Right,
are...
and if you use something like coal, they can't. Nobody has a right to pollute the air or your water or your property, and that's a property rights issue. It's not a regulatory socialist issue. Under the private property free market approach, nobody has a right to pollute. And unfortunately, in our early years in the Industrial Revolution, governments and industry got together and they polluted wholesale. But coal, if it can be cleaned up, it should be used. Wind, if people want to use it and it's efficient, they should use it. If nuclear power is efficient and clean, which I happen to believe is, it should be permitted. But government is involved so much in the pros and cons of it. We don't, we inhibit the drilling of gas and oil. We inhibit the building of refineries, and we go to war to protect oil. And yet the Pentagon burns up more oil than in one day than Sweden does in a year. That kind of thing. So there's a lot of waste in there. A lot of hydrocarbons are burned up by our own government. But you can't. There's no benefit to making exceptions. Say, well, we're for freedom in the market, except for such and such, and we know that a certain, say wind energy is the most efficient. And then say, well, let's put our subsidy in. It would cost too much and it wouldn't work. I think back in the time when wind energy should have developed is when the government decided that rural electrification would go out, and they stymied wind energy. And now we're back trying to build it again. But markets are smarter than governments, and renewable energy is just great. But whether corn is the best or whether it's sugar cane or whatever, if you allow government to make decisions, I know a couple of those bureaucrats and a couple of those politicians. They're not smart enough to know. Only the market can tell. But if you have strict rules against pollution and you have the rule of the marketplace, you will come up with the most efficient source of energy. I don't worry at all about, a lot of people in Washington worry about, we're running out of oil, we have to do something. If you have the market, something is going to come in. I think cars would, if we really ran out of oil, and you couldn't use coal, I think you'd have electric cars or something like that, and it would work. You could generate electricity, windmills or whatever. Maybe we'd have a car that we plug into our windmill or something. But I'd let somebody else sort it out, but not the politicians.
There's no consumations that are being forced on their children. What in the world can be done about that?
Interesting enough, that came up this morning when we had our little rally on the street about vaccination and forcing kids to have vaccination. Back to freedom of choice. They should never compel you to take a shot, and they shouldn't compel you to take care, compel you to give injection to your children. There are some definite dangers. There are obviously many, many benefits from immunizations. Polio in my lifetime was wiped out through immunization. So I have a very strong position on both. One, freedom of choice. Also, that some immunization is good, but I'm also aware as a physician of certain cases where children have been very, very severely damaged by immunizations. And we know the danger. We came across the cases in the Persian Gulf War, how immunizations contributed to very serious complications from our GIs when they came back. But you can find those answers usually in freedom of choice. And but this gets worse the more the government controls the expenditures on medicine. then they take this freedom of choice away. Not only, they might make the calculation, well, only 5% out of 100 gets complications, but the other 95 will be saved, so it's an economic calculation. Then they make an economic calculation about who gets treated in their older years and all these things. That's why you don't like government making these decisions in medicine. Besides, when the government gets control and drug companies are in control, they deny your access to natural substances, nutritional substances, and drug companies get involved because they get control of the government and they want to control these substances, and they put people out of businesses, and they're talking about WTO regulations that would regulate these substances. But freedom of choice should be preserved, but the responsibility should be on the person, the individual, the family. And if you make a mistake, you shouldn't come crawling to the government and say, well, I wanted to do this, but I messed up, now you take care of it. Self-reliance and freedom means you have to be responsible for your own acts.
Dr. Paul, could you clarify exactly what the government's role is? There's a lot of talk of what the government should not do. What, as you as president and the Congress and our government, do for us?
Almost the things that they have forgotten. They do a lot of things they shouldn't be doing and forget about to do it. They should protect our borders, and they don't do a very good job. We should have a strong national defense. I think our national defense has been undermined because our troops, the morale is low and the equipment is ruined. The foreign policy leads to terrorist attacks and these many things. We should have a strong national defense. We should defend our borders. We should have a judicial system. The Constitution mandates that they have a sound currency, making sure that they don't print money and have a Federal Reserve system. So you should have a sound currency, freedom, protection of contracts, and property rights. But it's more of keeping the government out of your hair is what they're supposed to do. But they're not supposed to do much more than that. There's very little. They're not obligated to provide what they call the entitlements. People say, well, don't you believe that we have a right to medical care? And you don't. You have a right to freedom. You have a right to seek that out. But you have a right to your life, and you have a right to your liberty, and you have obligations. But you don't have a right to a house or a right to a job, because when the government takes over that, they undermine the system that provides jobs and prosperity, so it backfires on us.
Well, I noticed that when the bridge collapsed in Minneapolis, which was a tragedy for Minneapolis, President Bush immediately rushed in there and said, federal government's going to rebuild this bridge or help Minnesota rebuild this bridge. Laura Bush went and visited the bridge. The president went and visited the bridge and promised a lot of things for Minneapolis. Do you agree with that? Do you feel that is?
I think it's political pandering is what happens when the politician rushes and they're going to say they're going to save everybody. But it is a mixed bag because they've taken a lot of money from us through highway funds. And then they take the money and they spend it on a war. And then the highway funds don't come back to us. And then the inspections don't occur.
Wasn't originally the highway funds, though, were part of national defense? That the interstate system was part of national defense?
That is right, because when Eisenhower did it in the 50s, they still had a little more respect for the Constitution, so they were looking for angles to justify the interstate highway system, so they did it under national defense purposes, which was nothing more than a gimmick and an argument that we had to justify. But when they take money, I try to get it back. There are a lot of programs that shouldn't exist, but I don't want to close them down immediately. There's too many people dependent on medical care and retirement benefits. Money's been taken from them. So you have to have some transitional programs. I would save the money from all the spending overseas and actually save enough to cut the deficit. At the same time, take care of certain problems. And although the states should really be responsible for bridges and highways, we are involved with that, but we literally could save enough money from overseas to take care of that. You know, it's sort of amazing that we allow our government to spend money blowing up bridges, and then we have to go and repair the bridges overseas, and then we don't even have enough money left over to inspect our own bridges. So I would think in a transitional period, if you would do those things, but to come and say, oh, I'm going to take care of you, what do you want, $100 billion, and vote for it, and they don't even have the money, that's irresponsible, because they're going to borrow it, put the burden on the kids, or print it, and gives us more inflation, which causes economic dislocations and financial bubbles and more problems. And that's an illusion. It's a myth that that's the way you can do it.
I wonder if you can comment on ag subsidies. The farm markets as it would be under our Constitution?
Under the Constitution, there should be no reason why one taxpayer should subsidize another. So agriculture subsidies are not part of a free society, a free market, or part of the Constitution. Tax credits are a little bit different because I believe in tax credits. I have a position where I always vote for a tax credit. To me, it's sort of like a tax deduction. I don't like the income tax, but until we get rid of it, anytime you can get a tax credit for your medical bills or anything else with education, I want them to have it. So if a farmer can get a tax credit and get some of their money back. But the only fair way to do that is to give it evenly for everybody. You know, not say, well, we like this industry and not this industry. We're going to reward them because they have more clout in Washington and not this one. So it should be as fair as possible. But tax credits, I endorse. But the subsidy, the whole principle of the subsidy is wrong because the consumer, regardless of what business you're subsidizing, the consumer has to pay the taxes for the subsidy, and then that pushes the prices up of the product, and the consumer gets hit again. Now, in a free market, the consumer really becomes the king. They should be voting on who's to succeed and who isn't, not the government. So if a government is failing, and then they need to subsidize it, which, you know, in the car industry and other industries, they get bailouts by the taxpayers, so inefficiencies are rewarded. But in the free market, the consumer decides who succeeds and who doesn't.
As president, would you be willing to reduce our nuclear arsenal down to 1,000 and save taxpayers?
I think 1,000 nuclear bombs would be enough to blow up the world about 2 or 3 times. I would think that we could do with that a lot less. But right now, there's a move on to build more. They're talking about, we need to do it. And I would say that we ought to be out of the business of arming the world. This past week or two, there was an announcement that $50 billion more weapons would be sold or granted, leases and low interest rates, into the Middle East. Can you imagine what the Middle East doesn't need is more weapons? But who do you think is motivated behind that? People who get to build them. Where does that money come? Out of your pockets. It's drained from the economy, and no wonder the people are having trouble. But you build these weapons, and you send them overseas or send them over there even into the war. I mean, that's production that's down a rat hole. The planes get blown up, people die, and yet the economy here suffers because those monies have been taken out. So whether it's building nuclear weapons, you should have an adequate amount of weapons to defend ourselves. And quite frankly, the odds of us being attacked, literally attacked militarily, are about slim to none right now. They're not going to do it, and yet we go around and with the war propaganda, we've been going into all these countries starting war, and almost every day there's an article. Today there was an article in the paper. The American government is blaming the Iranians for something happening in Iraq, and they're just conditioning the country to spread this war, and we have to do our darndest to stop that from happening.
Can you briefly comment on on Chinese goods in this country and the poisons, the lack of quality control, and we keep buying more and more goods from China, and our pets get poisoned, and then there's more reports on the other additives that are not good for us and poisonous slowly from China. Just kind of
right. There is certainly an imbalance in trade, and that's one subject with China. We're totally dependent on China for our goods. We don't manufacture, and they're our banker now because we borrow, and we depend on them completely. As far as goods coming into this country that are dangerous, we have a responsibility to deal with that. And if somebody comes in with the plague, that's a danger to us because we're not immune from the plague, and we have some responsibility there. Dangerous substances, yes. If somebody is marching in and you think they have a nuclear weapon, we have something to do with it. If it's less major than a nuclear weapon and dangerous substances, I think that we as a federal government has something to say about it. That is not a state issue. But there's also responsibility on everybody, and a lot of consumer groups will be aware of some of these dangers, and there's some self-responsibility that is involved as well. So we all have to be alert to that. There are some dangers on imported goods. That does not mean, though, that you should give up on the idea that we shouldn't have trade with people, because ultimately trade with countries is very beneficial. If you trade with countries, you're obviously less likely to fight with them. Okay, I think that'll do it. Joe, do you have another comment?
Just a couple comments. Thank you so much, Dr.
You should have a